Two cases which present staggering examples of potential human-alien contact would occur in the 1950s in North America. After the end of World War II, and at the dawn of what many to be considered the beginning of the UFO era, families in separate states would have run-ins with the inexplicable that would leave them shaken to their very cores. My name is Aaron Deese, and with me once again are Ron Murphy, Heather Mosier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Seth Breedlove. This is UFOs Revisited. So I think I'm among probably many in the communities that are interested in this stuff and saying that these are two cases I'm particularly fond of. I think they're very interesting and they're very fun. There are some serious implications and a very real human element that we'll discuss as we go. But let's start it off. We can talk about either one of these to begin with. What do we know about Braxy and the goblins?
Whatever happened at 7:30 on September 12th, 1952, in the small town of Flatwoods, West Virginia, remains perplexing, and I think it terrified those who saw it. We had several groups of families, the children from the Mays, the Hyers, the Lemon family, one very unfortunate dog, as history would remember, that see a light descend over a hill. And they ascend toward the hilltop as the daylight is fading, enter the forest. They see a light emanating from some kind of an object and maybe also some sort of a kind of mist, almost like what you'd expect from a science fiction film. And pretty quickly their attention is diverted over to a large object. You know, there's this sort of roughly humanoid figure, but we can get into that, what it actually looked like and whether we're talking about a being or we are talking about something else entirely. I mean, that's really, I think, part of the core of the question about Braxy and why it straddles the fence between ufology and cryptozoology. But in essence, they see something that the newspapers the following day reported as being like Frankenstein's monster, green Frankenstein's monster. And it scared them very badly. They also said that there had been some sort of an odor and something that was causing, irritation for them. Many of the family members got sick after the fact. Many of the individuals, they weren't all related, but the dog in particular, I believe, actually died after this incident. So it naturally was a strange situation, and it attracted almost immediately the attention of some really high-profile researchers like Ivan T. Sanderson and also Gray Barker, and he would really kind of chronicle this one as the intro to that famous book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And it still remains a perplexing incident. We don't really know exactly what happened. UFO or something even stranger.
And the name Braxy is a shorthand, I should probably say, that has resulted from the fact that this took place in Braxton County. So the creature is also referred to as the Flatwoods Monster, the Braxton County Monster. It has a few different names.
I think Braxton County Monster may have preceded Flatwoods Monster. I think Flatwoods is the name that most people know this by, and it stuck. But initially it had been given all different kinds of names, and now
the Green Monster. I believe the signs that you would see when you came into Flatwoods actually said the home of the Green Monster initially. That was like the way they. And in the newspapers, you are right about the Frankenstein monster. They also reference it breathing fire, and being the newspapers typically reported that it was 18 feet tall,
so
which no one said.
The general description, that we're most popularly seeing when we think about the Flatwoods Monster, what does this look like?
Well, it was you said humanoid, yeah, I guess, because it's standing upright, but it's around 13 feet tall. That's the way the witnesses put it. If we're talking about what the witnesses said they said it was shaped like a B-12 rocket. Right. They did not see arms. They did not see a head. There's basically a rocket-shaped object with, at the top, what could be considered to be a face, was where the eyes were two portholes. And one of the boys said that they thought they could see someone inside the portholes, actually piloting this thing. So I don't know how to describe what was seen, because what they actually saw is what I just described, whereas pop culture and newspapers and everything have made it into this lizard-like creature wearing a dress with arms, long scaly arms that, hands that reach out for the boys and chase them, with its flailing clawed hands. And none of the original witnesses said they saw hands. Depending on whose rendition of the events you're talking about. I had the honor of interviewing Eddie and Freddie May, and they were there, and Ed had never done an interview, so I was able to conduct the first interview with Ed. Freddie had done a few, but had sworn off actually doing any more television or anything of that sort, following the way the History Channel had portrayed him in one of their shows. He felt they had edited him to say things he didn't think. So their version of events is a very different telling from what most people know of the Braxton County monster incident. I feel the most important thing, and my duty as a filmmaker, is to correct one version in particular, which is the dog. The dog, according to Freddie and Eddie, that dog never died. Not that it never died. It lives to this day.
It's still alive.
Or it's still alive.
But the way Ed told it, or Fred told it, is that dog hunted squirrels with them for years after.
Really? So where did the reports about the dog dying seem to originate from?
That seems to come in when Barker and Sanderson get involved. So,
okay.
And it's what I'm confused about here is because I came into that making a movie about that story, and my understanding of it is everything you just said, but what I've never been able to figure out is when the deviation happens, because Sanderson and Barker come in, they claim that they took each of the boys separately from one another into a room, interviewed them, and all their stories line up. They also interviewed Kathleen May, and that's a very confusing aspect to the story for me, because Kathleen's story, you can hear her tell this story, you can read her written, interview from, I think it's Barker, but it might be Sanderson, word for word what she said, and she does give a description that does not align with the boys' description, the description of the creature that they gave me later, So this story begins with them seeing a UFO streaking across the sky, right? And then they're like, we got to run to they see it crash on top of this hill. They're like, we got to go up to the Bailey Fisher farm. That's what the hill was a farm at the time. The Bailey Fisher farm, they're going to go up the hill, and they're going to look for what they think is gold. For some reason, they thought that whatever had crashed might have gold on it. So they go up the hill, and on their way up the hill, the retelling that Sanderson and Barker give is that they see a craft off the side of the hill. They approach the craft. They see this strange green smoke, or a mist in the air. The mist I'm unclear on. I could not get Ed and Fred to vouch for this mist, but it is a key piece of the story. But supposedly there was definitely a sulfuric smell in the air. They did talk about that. They did not recall ever seeing a craft. They saw a light come down, land on top of the hill, or crash into the hill, and then they went up the hill. They think Kathleen did approach something in the woods, but got scared and came back up and rejoined them. They don't think she saw a craft. However, again, if you read Sanderson and Barker's retelling, they're all walking up this hill, they see this craft, they literally put eyes on the craft, which is sort of an egg-shaped craft in the woods, and then they continue on up the hill, which is where they are when they encounter the Flatwoods monster. It's just a very convoluted mess as to where the differences between the actual witnesses' retelling of events, happen, and where Barker and Sanderson get all this other information. I'm not sure.
Here again, we see the importance of oral history and sitting down and speaking to witnesses about things.
Right.
Right.
And we also see the importance of perspective. I mean, you have three boys, children, and you have their parents seeing different things, explaining it in different ways. There's a lot to unpack here, right? You have physical effects, you have smells, so it's a very interesting case.
Okay, not only perspective, but how about agendas as well, too? because Barker and Sanderson would each have a different agenda as well.
And that brings us back to something we've talked about already. Gray Barker's name's come up a lot in our conversations. And again, one common thread that I've noticed is I enjoyed his writing, but I've taken everything he says with a grain of salt because he was known in many cases. I'll say it if nobody else will, and I've said it already. He liked to put these elements into the story that made for a better story, but were not always factual. And in instances that people have come forward and talked about over the years, they have said that they were encouraged by him when they pitched stories to his newsletters and publications. He encouraged them to do the same thing, embellish just a little bit. You know, in fact, you might just make up the name of an organization and some people who are members of it and say that this is something that they told you rather than you telling it. That will make it more important, and that makes a lot of sense in terms of the dog dying. The dog, actually, the Lazarus dog, we'll call it, it didn't die at all. It kept hunting for years.
I wondered if that was the inspiration for Paul.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so.
And that's unfortunate that that happens because it makes our jobs so much more difficult when that.
It does.
It does. So how did Sanderson get involved in this, and how soon did these researchers come onto the scene? Now,
There's an interview with Sanderson on the Long John Nebel show that is super interesting. And I think a lot of us, that's where our full knowledge of that case comes from. That was when I first became interested in the Flatwoods Monster case, I looked up that interview and listened to it. I don't recall how Sanderson became involved. I feel like he was, for some reason, in the area and then ended up linking up with Barker. Right. And they conduct these interviews together, as I understand it. Barker is on the scene ahead of Sanderson, though, which that might clue you into something right there. Because Barker's retelling of events is always going to be very different. You were talking about Barker, and the first thing that popped into my mind was his Silver Bridge book. What's his book about the Mothman? It's got Silver Bridge in the title. It might just be the Silver Bridge.
Yeah, maybe so, yeah.
But that's the book that preceded, I believe, the Mothman prophecies that retells the events of 66 and 67, but it's told through Barker's lens. And he admitted later that large chunks of that book were wholly made up. And so just his name being involved in the Flatwoods Monster case raises red flags immediately when you're reading his rendition of it. So like you said, the best thing you could do is go to the actual witnesses. And when I interviewed the original witnesses, the stories are just very, very different.
So is there, past that, are there variations in the story based on what? So did they go to the police afterwards? Were there health effects afterwards? Like, what parts are added?
So they definitely called the police afterward, and the police show up. There's, I think, two police officers show up, and then the military does show up that same night. The military goes up the hill. There's all these stories about tracks being found, Flatwoods Monster tracks. Supposedly those are actually the tracks of a truck. Someone that lived nearby, a farmer, had driven up the hill after this all happened because he was curious about the events. But the same night, so prior to the military's arrival, this truck drives up there. That's what left these tracks that later there's a newspaperman there from the Braxton, whatever the Braxton County newspaper's called. He takes photos of those tracks, and later it becomes, these are, Flatwoods Monster tracks, but they were from a farmer that had gone to hell. So yes, they called the police. Military does show up. The man who was in charge of the National Guard unit that came out and investigated has been on record. I think in our movie we have an interview from him talking about it. And he did feel that there was some sort of concerted cover-up of the event, but he did not say that they removed a monster or anything like that.
Did the family members that you interviewed after the fact, did they also say that military presence had been noted?
Mm-hmm.
They remembered that?
Yes, yeah, they remembered it from the same night. There's a National Guard unit stationed nearby, I want to say Gassaway, which is a neighboring town, and they had come out to investigate it and had removed something from the scene. The other thing he pointed out, and this could have just been from the truck that came up there, but there was some sort of grease or oily substance all over. Yeah, and he vouched for that as well, the National Guardsman that was in charge of that.
Was there any communications between whatever they're witnessing and themselves? Was it telepathic, electronic, no communication?
No, and it's a you got to kind of think of looking at a rocket,
Right.
and there's nothing there. And Frank Fascino wrote a book about the Flatwoods Monster that's extremely in-depth, that I've never read, for other reasons that I can't talk about. But I've never read the book, but he goes very in-depth on this, and I have seen illustrations that were in that book that portray some sort of creature on the other side of those portholes for eyes, sort of piloting this giant rocket.
That's interesting. It's also kind of neat that there's this insinuation that something was removed after the military goes in there, because again, I think if the time frame matches, let's see, 1952, right? So would that have coincided with the onset of that famous Project Moondust? How close are we there?
I believe that was
53.
53.
So we're right in there.
This was the inaugural case. This would have been the catalyst for Project Moondust. But I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, if there had been anomalous incidents that were occurring and they were recovering, being made early on, I think when we discussed Project Moondust, our contention had been, why would they have had a retrieval of foreign objects that fall from space program prior to Sputnik? We hadn't put anything in space. We wouldn't presumably have acquired anything the Soviets had put up because they hadn't put anything yet. So were there incidents where things, maybe going back well in advance of Project Moondust, the example we would have given was Roswell, but had there been other cases where the military became involved in retrievals of things?
Potentially.
It's worth noting that object that they saw crash on that hill wasn't the only object that crashed that night. So there's 5 other objects that crashed that night, or 4 other objects, I guess, because I think it was 5 in total. One of them had crashed in Gasaway. So, and then there was one that went down over the Elk River. I can't remember where the other 2 were, but the one that had gone down over the Elk River, the same group that showed up in Flatwoods was also tasked with investigating that. They didn't find the object. What they had been told is that a plane had crashed somewhere over the Elk River. They show up trying to find the plane, or whatever. Yeah. And there's nothing there. This is all coinciding with a UFO wave that started somewhere over Michigan, was tracked all the way down to Alabama.
And that same year, again, 1952, I mean, we had the famous Washington case too.
Yeah, that's true. So this wasn't the only UFO incident, and it wasn't the only UFO incident. That wave of objects that was tracked all the way down to Alabama was kind of a big deal. There's reports, you can trace this through UFO databases, all the reports that were happening all the way on this trajectory that starts in Michigan and goes down to Alabama. The other thing that I found while making the movie that's super interesting is that this is part of that. When we're talking about the Mothman stuff from 66, 67, how those sightings go all the way into the 70s, it seems to have started in the 50s, right around the same time. And I interviewed locals who had stories about just UFOs landing behind the barn behind their house, or like a strange jelly bean UFO bouncing across a cemetery, and like weird stories, but they're prevalent everywhere down there. This is also not the only Flatwoods Monster sighting. There's a sighting that happens, I believe, a day later, or possibly even that same night, but it's a delivery driver who's driving with his wife, who encounters, I wish I could remember his name, I'm blanking on it, who encounters a creature similar to the Flatwoods Monster. Again, this is a Sanderson Barker edition, and you've got, in this case, it seems to not be wearing the upper part of its armor, because it's just a full-blown, like, reptilian-looking creature, with long scaly arms that attacks him, supposedly is emitting this mist, causes him to get sick and vomit all over the car. Eventually he leaps into the car and him and his wife leave the scene. Now, one super interesting and fun story that I came across while we were making the movie was a story from a lady who had written about it in her journal, and her granddaughter had found it much later in life, possibly even after the elderly lady had passed. But it was a story that preceded the Flatwoods case by 2 weeks. And it's a story about her and her sister, they were walking home from school and supposedly encountered a glowing ball of light in a field that turned into the Flatwoods monster. What she describes is very similar to the Flatwoods monster, but she's recalling this event that supposedly happened 2 weeks prior to the Flatwoods sighting. She did not tell anybody about it. Her granddaughter found it much later in life.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's well before the interdimensional kind of theories, right?
So there's a lot more surrounding this case than the common narrative, and it's fortunate that, Seth was able to speak with the actual witnesses a few years ago, so we do have this kind of corrective, or at least more personal telling, that we can separate from these investigators. And this case has captured a lot of imagination, not just within our community, but it's spread into pop culture. Characters that are very resemblant of Braxy appear in the Legend of Zelda series. There are characters that look like them that show up in other video game properties, even very recently in the Fallout universe, if you follow that sort of thing. And this is not the only case involving close potential extraterrestrial contact that has made its way into pop culture. And I think that's a good bridge to kind of step into the second segment of our discussion today.
Can I mention really quickly, too, this sort of reminds me very recently of what just happened in Florida. I mean, this very, very tall.
I think, yeah, and bringing that up here with the Hopkinsville, I think that does have a very good, also the Battle of Los Angeles as well, too, has a bit of a reference to that as well.
Right. I mean, I think that's really interesting. This is a very tall being, many police officers, I don't know.
Very interesting, yeah. So we kind of see this sort of response and narrative mirrored in even some of these contemporary cases. I hadn't made that parallel. That's interesting. The other case that I want to focus on today takes place kind of in the same time period. We're a couple years later, post-Project Moondust, 1955. We're in a different state, and we're going to the Hopkinsville area of Kentucky. This is an interesting place right off the bat. It is about 30 miles from the land between the lakes, a concentrated area of noted high strangeness that we won't get into today because that would take too long. It is the home of noted psychic Edgar Casey, whose grave is there to this day. You can go visit it. And it is also very, very close to the area in which the noted UFO incident involving Thomas Mantell took place, kind of around in the same general time period as well. It's possible Small Town Monsters might have covered that case in more detail in a film.
I've heard of it.
Yes, Lost Contact.
Lost Contact, come on.
Check out Lost Contact. But already we're talking about a place that is very strange and very concentrated. We often talk about, and have talked about on this show, how a lot of these cases come out of West Virginia. But this little corner of Kentucky, very close to the border of Tennessee, is similar in a lot of ways. So what do we know about the Hopkinsville goblins?
Well, again, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say somebody went out to fetch some water. It was a friend of the family, the Sutton family, which is odd that it's the Sutton family and you were just in Sutton, West Virginia area. But anyway, they were outside and saw a streak of light over the house and pretty shortly saw a creature, a little goblin, if you will, what we've known to be the little green men, coming out of the woods. And they eventually descend upon the house, and the family starts firing at them, and the bullets kind of just ricochet off of them. But they're these little, like 3.5 foot tall little humanoids with some exaggerated features, and we end up with this story of this family in a firefight all night with the Hopkinsville goblins.
Which is responded to by police officers who then have their own UFO sightings while en route to the location. I think that's something that's very, very interesting about this one.
Yeah, law enforcement, of course, responding to this case because it was quite a scene out there at the Sutton farm. They claimed that they'd been accosted all night, these little beings, these goblin-like creatures trying to get into their homestead. When police respond, they seem to see lights in the sky. I mean, according to one account, I think that there had even been more of a structured object, but at very least there were lights that were seen by the responding officers, which is kind of interesting because one might make a correlation to the recent claims of these very tall beings, seen in Las Vegas. When police responded, there had been a streak of light seen through the sky that night. Astronomers said it was probably a meteor or a fireball, but police said, yeah, we saw something in the sky, and then these kids...
Interestingly, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's how the UFOs that these police officers saw were described. The terms that I wrote down were several meteors, which emitted a sound like artillery moving in the direction of the house.
Exactly, so it's very similar in that aspect to this recent case. But so there were others who saw things in the sky that night, not just this family. Now the problem, of course, had been, and this is a strange one for me, people said, well, they were probably drinking. Now, listen, I've had a beer or two before, and never have I ever seen a UFO, and that really bothers me because no matter how much beer I drink, I never see UFOs. I keep trying. It just doesn't seem fair. I keep trying.
Have you ever seen goblins?
I've never seen goblins either.
Right,
I keep trying. So, but the point is I love it when people say somehow that, alcohol consumption is associated with people thinking they've seen UFOs. Turns out, actually, the Sutton family said we don't even allow alcohol in the house. They apparently, that was part of their beliefs, and so they said we had not been drinking that night when we encountered these things. So that was ruled out immediately. But it kind of shows how there's this stigma, these people think they saw UFOs. They must have been into their cups. It hadn't been the case in this instance. So.
Another interesting thing that sticks out to me, it's a very interesting case from top to bottom, but when these creatures were fired upon, not only did they didn't die, they got up and kept moving, but they emitted metallic sounds that were described in some cases like buckshot hitting an empty bucket.
Well, yeah, an odd little connection there, too. If you recall in the Caracas Dwarves case, Mr. Gonzalez had said when he tried to grab this little being, as you do, when I, see creatures I can't explain, with claws for hands, I'm going to go grab them and see if I can catch one, right? And he says when he does this, it's like 50 pounds, really lightweight little guy, grabs it, and it flies up in the air or something. Well, the Hopkinsville goblins, when they were shot with shotguns, the description of how they behaved when they were fired on is really strange. They not only seem impervious to the shots being fired at them, but they kind of would roll backwards and then drift up into a tree and kind of like, not fly, but kind of float, I think is how it was described, up into a tree and do all these weird little things. So they seem to be very lightweight too, enough so that they could be carried away on the wind maybe.
Right. It doesn't seem as if our physics on this planet apply to them.
Right.
Yeah.
Or that gravity literally affected them differently, or that there was something else going on there that caused this weird behavior.
Skeptics point to that as being a indication that they were owls.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Or monkeys, right? Escaped carnival monkeys as well, too.
Yeah, and interestingly, the owl theory has been offered for Braxy, too.
Yes.
I've heard. And Mothman, yeah.
And Willie Strieber.
Yeah, who said he literally saw owls at his window. Now, my colleague Mike Cleland, of course, has written a couple of really interesting books that kind of analyze the intercontinuity between the UFO experience and owls, and the mythological interest there being that, owls often associated with wisdom and things along these lines, and other things by various cultures that seem to at times kind of, have some relationship to UFOs. So that's interesting in itself. But as far as the literal interpretation of Braxy or these, whatever the Sutton family saw as being owls, I've always found that to be a pretty dubious argument, just because, the Sutton family said we clearly saw humanoids. There were very explicit details that were mentioned about these. With Braxy, obviously the witnesses were pretty scared. It was kind of dark. It was a fleeting glimpse they would have gotten at best. And they certainly didn't describe anything that sounded like an owl. But in the case of Hopkinsville Kelly, it seems a lot more difficult to me to assume that owls are a good explanation for that.
Well, this many people living in rural Kentucky know what an owl looks like. I'm sorry, to put it simply.
Yeah.
At some point, someone is going to go, it's fine, it's an owl. You can stop shooting.
I've seen a lot of owls. I've seen some large ones, and they can get very, very large, and they sound even stranger if you encounter them in the woods. I've heard certain owls that literally at first I thought it was somebody up on the hill. Their call can be so funny. I thought somebody was pranking me until, it dawns on me it's just an owl doing his thing. But never when I've seen one, and I've seen many, did I ever in any way equate that with being a humanoid. And to think that the Sutton family, probably having had similar experiences, lived in the rural part of Kentucky that they had their entire lives, that they would suddenly mistake owls for humanoids trying to enter their home just seems baffling to me.
Yeah.
Did these guys communicate? Did they
Yeah,
communicate?
they were trying to, but they kept shooting them, you know.
Stop. Did they stop?
That's a good question because this is
They're trying to ask for a quarter.
this is kind of another case where it looks like, at least with regards to Kelly Hopkinsville, where they could just be observing, trying to check things out and see what's going on. And oh my God, they're shooting at us. What is this?
Well, they weren't taking soil samples.
These guys, right? No
Yeah,
soil
how does this end?
How does it end?
It ends with the police leaving the property, and the family allegedly had additional encounters throughout the night,
really?
at which point they were like, call them back, they've already been out once. And the last encounter, the last appearance, I believe, was around 6 or 7 in the morning. So this went on throughout the night. And what's interesting is that the police, of course, didn't witness the creatures themselves. They didn't witness the UFOs. They did witness the evidence of the battle, if you like, gunshot damage everywhere. And one of the officers did note a glowing patch on the ground where one of the creatures fell after being shot. And that he went on record to say that there does appear to be some kind of a stain here on the ground. So the police did witness and document kind of trace evidence of this event. They didn't see the creatures
The
themselves.
military supposedly did come the next day.
Oh, did they?
And they found a spot, like a perfectly round burned spot on the ground where they presumed like a ship landed, but I guess they never roped anything off. They never took samples or anything like that. But
Interesting.
I was just
Kind
going
of
to
a
say,
knock
missed
against-
opportunity to gather some samples.
It's a knock against the owl theory too, I think. If they're firing that many shots, someone's going to hit an owl.
Yeah.
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 With a shotgun, certainly.
And it would stop. Like if you're shooting guns, the owls fly away, it's going to be quiet the rest of the night, right?
And these are people trained and accustomed to the use of firearms. It's not like if you hand me a shotgun and say, go get an owl, boy, I won't be able to do it. No, I think they could pull it off, especially at the close ranges that are being described, because some of these things were said to have popped up in the window, very close to, basically just giving you a target box. I mean, I think even I could pull that off.
Yeah. Now, this case is often, cited as a Project Blue Book case, and although it did occur during that time, and yes, there was at least some cursory interest, I think this is another good example of how Project Blue Book did not do a very exhaustive investigation. In fact, there was much better investigative work, interviewing the witnesses and what have you, by a member of the local news media. I think he had worked with one of the local radio stations, and he called up there and spoken to him. And I think that the bulk of what ended up being cataloged by Project Blue Book about this, what little had actually been taken from interviews that civilians had done. So although they were investigating, they made a pretty mild attempt to actually investigate a case where here we have, and it is a seemingly extraordinary case, so maybe that's part of the reason why. But I know that if at the height of a UFO wave period, there's a lot of sightings. Americans say that they're flying objects. I've got a family in rural Kentucky, and they're saying that they just have had an encounter with humanoid occupants in conjunction with UFO sightings. I'm not going to make a couple of phone calls. I'm going to go there, and I'm going to go and try and collect physical evidence, and I'm going to go and I'm going to speak to the witnesses, right? And this is just another of those instances where I don't think Blue Book really fulfilled its purported duty. That taxpayer dollar at work, folks, right?
There do seem to be some missing pieces. Like if a more extensive investigation had been done with this many witnesses, what more might we have on record? Yeah.
Is this still in this part of Kentucky? Whether these are cryptids or extraterrestrials, is there still activity in Kentucky to this day? Is it like become folklore in the area?
Some would say that there are goblins up around that area,
Yeah, I'm just wondering if they're still being seen today.
Well, Praxi, of course, has a museum, right? So you can go there,
It's like feeding like the Sasquatch or Bigfoot,
When it comes to Flatwoods, the sighting stopped. I mean, there's a comparable case. You're gonna have to help me with this. Wheeling, what was that thing called? Yeah, Bashful Billy.
Bashful Billy.
And that's around the same year, right?
Best cryptid name ever.
Yeah, Bashful Billy, but almost identical in description to Flatwoods. Yeah, around the same time, and that's in like downtown Wheeling. But as far as like later sightings of the Flatwoods monster, there are not, unless you consider the fact that the local media started calling anything seen unusual Flatwoods monster, because you have in the 70s and 80s a whole host of Bigfoot sightings coming out of that area, Braxton County, where they call it the return of the Flatwoods monster. But you read it and it's like, this is clearly not the same thing.
Yeah, Keel even talked about that with Mothman. He had said that a lot of the sightings of Mothman had really probably been more like, hairy bipeds and things along those lines. And even some had just been sightings of what unequivocally appeared to be very large birds, nothing like an anthropomorphic, winged being or anything along those lines. So again, in that process of myth building, anytime you get a good story, once you have an area where a popular legend has gained foothold and it's kind of the anchor point, you'll see that pretty frequently. The beast has returned, and it's like you look at these two stories and they're completely different things.
That's right.
We even see that a little bit with West Virginia Veggie Man.
Sure.
We have the primary witness account, and then his mother describes something completely different. And yet people are saying the first time Veggie Man is seen is by the witness's mother, and they're, again, comparing these two things, they seem to be very different.
And blossom, yeah.
If all this is, if these three stories in particular are a hoax, right? Like, say, because that's another skeptical response to a lot of this stuff is, well, it's a hoax. Why don't more people hoax the same creature then? Because you think if people are so inclined to just make up stories. If you have a story in front of you about the 100 goblins besieging a house, why not make up your own, goblin sighting a year later? But you don't really see ongoing Flatwoods monster sightings. You don't really see ongoing goblin sightings. You don't even see ongoing sightings of something like the Grafton monster, which is a neighboring town that had this weird headless white thing that was seen once.
Right.
Like, it doesn't carry on. So you'd think if people were just that prone to making up a story based on other stories, it doesn't follow through.
While both of these cases present striking parallels and contrasts, we can be reasonably sure in both cases that something happened. The truth behind the events of both Braxy and the goblins may yet to be determined.